Welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered with Perry Clark. This program looks at mental health from unique perspectives and shows you how to manage your life by finding the knots that help you and stay away from the ones that could be a disadvantage. Now, here is your host, Perry Clark.
Welcome back to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with you. I want to remind everyone that this podcast is for entertainment and education purposes only. This does not constitute working with a mental health provider. I do recommend you seek out one that's in your area. And I do want to remind you that many of us do work via telehealth, so you can find a provider anywhere across your state, even if you can't find one in your immediate area or works with your unique needs. So that being said, let's get on to what we're talking about today. So if you listen to the special episode, one of the special episodes that came out, especially back at the end of the last year, I had a conversation with Mercedes Salamudio about Wakanda Forever. Well, this time, not doing a special episode, but a part of our regular recordings, we're going to do something very similar. And only in this case, I've brought back Elizabeth Arvizu. Sadly, we can't call her doctor yet. She's still working on that. To talk about another one of these lovely little moments in geekdom, but that also overlaps with us in mental health. And today we're going to talk a bit about a particular comic book series that came out from DC Comics in around 2018 to 2019 called Heroes in Crisis. But we'll get into that in a bit more. But I want to, again, remind you of who we are here I'm going to be talking with. So Elizabeth is a first generation of Mexican American in the process of obtaining a PhD in clinical psychology. She created the website Psychology for Geeks and its social media counterpart, Superpowered Toolkit, to eliminate stigma on mental health and in the geek community, as well as providing a safe space for geeks everywhere to geek out. In October 2021, she released her new social media series, Reframe and Re-enchant. The series helps promote geek therapy projects by geek therapists and provides fun ways we can get out and take care of our health. Welcome back, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Just one quick correction. So I ended up changing my, no worries. I ended up changing my name on social media, or like my social media handle. It's now at Psych for Geeks.
At Psych for Geeks.
And to match with the website.
Gotcha.
But I'm so excited.
Got to keep the branding straight, completely there. But thank you for coming back on, and thank you for talking with us, because you can also talk from the PhD, more the PhD level, even if you don't have the doctorate title yet, as I talk from the master's level and the aspects of it.
Yeah, I'm very excited. Thank you for inviting me back. I've had this book for a while now, and I was just sitting there, and you gave me a reason to read it. So I am really, really happy about that.
Well, especially because my partner was telling me about this particular series, and I had just not had a chance to go delve on it. And I forget exactly what it was, but this sparked the idea. Is like, okay, let's go read this and then talk about it on the podcast. So again, we're going to be talking about Heroes in Crisis, which is from DC Comics. And it was originally written by, the lead writer on it was Tom King, and the lead artist was Clay Mann. And this was done in 2018, 2019. So we're also looking at this essentially almost 5 years later, or 4 to 5 years later, and how our thoughts about mental health have shifted, especially as we deal with the mental health crisis that we have been sitting in since the start of the pandemic.
Yeah, it's still really relevant, though. I didn't even pay attention to when it was released, but everything that was in there, I was like, oh yeah, like it's something like topics that I constantly talk about with, the people that I work with, or things that I'm trying to learn more, or even that I experience in my own life. A lot of it was like, oh, there needs to be like a whole series just on this, because it was so interesting. And it was sometimes it was just a few pages that it was addressed, or it was just a little tiny picture, where it was brought up, and I'm like, oh, this is really good.
So we're going to be trying to talk about this from one of three areas, and we're probably going to be intermingling as we go along. We're going to be talking about this from the place of mental health professionals. We're going to be talking about this from the place as geeks, and then also, depending on what we see here, also what it means to be POC persons, both of that are geeks and of mental health aspects. So I admit, after I read it, part of me just kind of felt like, okay, I actually could have done, well, we're not going to try and give too many spoilers because we want you to read this as well. But one of the key things that happens in here is a murder, or a series of murders. On some level, I kind of think that the murders got in the way of the other side of the mental health story that was going on there. But that's just me. I can see where they needed to tie it in because, again, superheroes are trying to solve crime. So what happens when you have a crime at a place like this?
Yeah, no, I agree with you that I was kind of confused, or maybe it's because, I geek out about mental health, not only superheroes. So I was like, oh no, you need to talk more about this specific like mental health topic. It would have been, I think, maybe a bit better. But I can see why, the storyline or the detective aspect of figuring out what happened was added to it.
Which, and just with some of the other themes that I know show up in comic books, I think they probably could have used something else other than the idea of there had to be a giant mystery at essentially a superhero mental health facility.
I really like the idea because I know we talked about it like back when we like first met, and I think that's when I bought the book, and I just never read it. But the idea of it, like having a place for superheroes to go and get help, was such a huge thing for me because I'm not very into the comic books. I just sort of grew up with the cartoons and like now the movies. So I'm like, but I never really heard of that. And it was such an interesting concept. And in my head, I was like, well, that's what we're trying to do. Well, like when we incorporate like geek culture into therapy, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to provide a safe space for everyone to come and like seek help and like just geek out. And that was such a great idea for me. And then I'm like, wait, at the end of it, I was like, are they going to continue having that? Like, it was such a great like idea for heroes to have a place to like rest and relax, and like then keep going, because it is very difficult job to be a superhero.
Well, not just a hero, just in the standpoint of you're literally talking about somebody who's putting their literal life, depending on what type of abilities they have, into physical harm. Purposely putting yourself into physical harm. Now, we have this with firefighters and many of the first responders and so forth, but I mean, this is the literal aspect of you are purposely putting yourself in the frame of a bullet. You're putting yourself purposely in the frame of a sword. You're putting yourself literally to get crushed by an asteroid.
Yeah, and there were some of them that like even talked about how they were like, oh, well, I don't really have any superpowers, but like I'm still trying to help people and like do the right thing. And I'm like, oh yeah, like it just makes me think of Batman. Batman was sort of, I think, my original favorite superhero. Because he was just so intelligent, and I loved that. After a while, I think I sort of forgot about it, and as I grew up and like I had different life experiences, I sort of changed a little bit. But you know what? I think I'm gonna jump the gun a little bit and talk about like what it means to be sort of like, like a person of color and like read this comic book.
Please.
Because when you mentioned it earlier, I started thinking about it, and I'm like, I kind of briefly thought about it as I was reading it. And then I'm like, there's a lot of heroes that I really like. Wonder Woman is amazing. Especially like the way that it was portrayed by Gal Gadot was like amazing. I just loved her. And again, Batman was one of my original favorites. But then I realized, I was like, but they're not like my absolute favorites now. And I didn't really consider about like, or thought about why they weren't my favorites anymore. Until I started thinking more about it. And I'm like, I think it's because I couldn't identify with them fully. There were aspects of them that I was like, oh, I like that. For example, like Green Arrow. He was really funny in the Justice League Unlimited cartoons. And I loved him because of that. And I love Wonder Woman because of this other specific thing, and Batman. So I just took like little aspects of them that I tried to like, oh, that's kind of what I wanted to be when I grew up, or like the kind of adult I wanted to be. But I never really had a superhero where I was like, yes, exactly. Like I can completely identify with you.
Exactly. And that also does, I hate to say, show up a lot here, that the entire storyline centers around, or it focuses on essentially the white characters.
Yeah.
there's not a POC character that is actually amongst the recognition about mental health in this, other than some of the victims that end up dying at the facility called Sanctuary. So it kind of makes me wonder how this story would have been written now if we had that part was incorporated more.
Yeah. So I'm actually learning a lot more about my own culture, and for my culture, in the Mexican culture, family and community are very important, and that's something that we end up missing when we immigrate to like a different country, and we leave sort of everyone behind. And in my head I was like, why didn't anybody else understand how much Wally lost? You know, and I'm like, everybody was like, oh, I'm so happy you're back. But they didn't acknowledge that, hey, you lost so much because of us. Sorry. Like nothing. I'm like, are you okay? Because he was clearly not okay, and nobody ever like talked about it.
Which then again brings up the aspect of, again, is there a component of this where who they focused on in this story missed that opportunity?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, because I know, and now that I think about it, I probably should have a conversation with Dr. Gamble about the other side of DC with the with the Black Lightning storyline. So I'm going to be going checking out and see if I can do another one of these. But that standpoint of, like you said, would any of the POC characters have been able to recognize what was going on in Wally a lot sooner? And equally, how does this also play into the messages and the stigma and the pain that we encounter with mental health issues?
And even too, the other way around, like, would it have been a lot faster if Wally was Mexican? Like, and if he had like a big community where he could like talk to people, or like that he trusted, because obviously he trusted, the big three, or the main three, Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. Yeah.
Or the other Flash.
Right. But he didn't trust them enough to be able to say, hey, I'm really struggling with this. And as I'm learning more about my culture, I realized that like as we moved on, and like now we're talking more about mental health, which is fantastic, but also there has been a big change in how mental health is seen by people of color. Because I've been studying to be a psychologist for a long time, and when I started, my parents will say things like, oh, therapy's for crazy people, or like only people who really need help go. And I think if we look back to our ancestors, that was not the case. Like mental health was something that was important and valued. And if you needed help, like you had people around you, because if somebody was, struggling with something, it was the problem of the whole community. So the whole community had a part to play in how they supported you. And now that I'm saying this, like what my parents mentioned, like that's actually in like the in the comics, because Wonder Woman, and I wrote this down, Wonder Woman went to to ask for help, or just to talk about what she was struggling with, and at the end she got up and left saying, I just prefer to bite my lip, like I don't want like somebody else needs help, but I don't really need help.
Right. And in that particular moment, as I recall, she was talking about an experience where she as a child needed some sort of support, which she couldn't do because her mother was in her own crisis at that particular moment.
Right. Yeah.
And that also speaks to a lot of situations that we even see in our offices, how many people were in crises, but because of other circumstances, no one noticed, or they minimized because of it.
Yeah, or it was this thing where like, oh, well, so and so is struggling a lot more, or they need me right now, so I don't have time to care of myself. I see it a lot in parents, where I cannot tell you how many times I've asked a parent, oh, so what are your hobbies? And then they describe hobbies that they do or things that they do with their children, for their children. And I'm like, well, that's great. You can also enjoy that. But what do you do for yourself? Like, what do you like outside of like hanging out with your children? And it's like, oh, and then there's like this moment of realization of like, oh, I stopped having hobbies after I had children, or like, I can't remember the last time I did something for myself. So yes, everything that I like read, I was like, yes, this is something that we talk in therapy. It was very relatable in some way or another, because it's something that we experience through life, the need to have a safe space and receive support from our community and have other ones notice when we're not doing so well. Because sometimes we're so stuck in that we're struggling and we're trying to like just survive, and crawl out of like that dark hole that we're in, that we forget that sometimes there's people that we can reach out to. So having someone that asks us, hey, are you okay? And we actually saw that, right? In that sort of like the relationship with Harley Quinn and Poison Ivy, right? And because she was there. Yeah. She was there to support her. Yeah.
And even too, it's also in what we saw when Batgirl comes to support Harley Quinn, and when between Booster Gold and Blue Beetle too.
Yes, I love that. At first I was a little suspicious, and I'm like, oh, wait, because I couldn't really figure out like what had happened or not, or who was responsible for it. And when Blue Beetle was like, oh no, what did he say? It was bros before heroes or something like that. And I'm like, oh, okay, I like that. Yeah. And then afterwards I was like, wait, but are you helping him like escape? Are you also good, or were you in on it? But then afterwards it was revealed like that they had a very trusting relationship. I get to bring it back. I don't know much about Blue Beetle, but my brother has sort of mentioned it sometimes. Well, is he originally supposed to be like not white?
So there's for those what history I follow, there's more than one Blue Beetle.
Oh, okay, gotcha. So we don't really know what this one is.
Well, no, this one is before the one that's getting the movie.
Oh, okay. So it's not the same one I'm thinking of then.
Right. This Blue Beetle is sort of there. As far as I remember, there's supposed to be 3 of them. One of them had been starting to be able to use the Blue Beetle scarab initially, but it was limited. The second one used the technology based off of the Blue Beetle to build his technology. And the one that's coming out in the movie, which is a Hispanic character, is actually using the Blue Beetle as a battle suit.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think that's the one I was sort of introduced to.
I think it's
probably in one of the cartoons. Yeah.
Probably the Brave and the Bold.
I think so. Yeah.
If not, there's a whole section of the Young Justice that centers around them too.
Oh my gosh, it's been so long since I watched cartoons, and I'm like, I think I need to go rewatch this.
What were you just saying about your own hobbies for yourself?
I do have a lot of hobbies. I need to like not have as many, I guess. I have a lot of.
Yeah, I've got a lot. I've got several stacks, almost 2 to 3 years worth of comic books I still need to read. That's one of those things that went out the window when the pandemic started for me.
But you know what? That's a different hobby. Like collecting audience books and things you want to read. It's a slightly different hobby than reading them.
Yes, but I also want to sit down and read them too.
That's true. Yeah. And there's so many books that I have like a pile like close to my bed, so I can just like reach at night, like right before bed, just to read a couple of chapters or whatever. And it's a mix between like mental health things that I'm trying to learn more about, and a mix of like, oh, this is really interesting. I want to read this one series that has nothing to do with mental health. But
exactly. Now, on that note, one of the things that's also very key, which is one of the things they spoke about here, is the secrets that all of these heroes are divulging to essentially the computer system that runs Sanctuary, who is serving as their therapist. everything gets deleted after they walk out of the therapy room. And in this case, again, not giving too many spoilers, those secrets get put out into the world, which is what forces the world to know that heroes are going to sanctuary for mental health. And this brings up a big issue that we often talk about, especially with our first clients, is the issue of confidentiality.
Yeah, and I was also thinking too, maybe because I am also like a practicing therapist now, where I'm like, no, a computer cannot replace a person. It's different, even though we are human and we make mistakes and we might not be like the most qualified person sometimes. That's why referrals exist. But like I was like, no, why would it be a computer? Why can't it be like a person? But I guess I kind of understand superhero role is slightly different than because the computer system in Sanctuary is based off of Kryptonian technology, which is running off of a variant of Brainiac. But it's supposed to have the strength of Superman, the compassion of Wonder Woman, and the knowledge and will of Batman. And I'm just started thinking about that as like, okay, I can see the compassion for Wonder Woman. I can see the strength, but why does it have to be the will or for Batman? It could be some other things, components, but equally to that the resiliency of Batman.
That would be a better option to speak to the quality that is being spoken by this computer. But I also agree with you the aspect of, why is a computer doing this as opposed to a human or even another alien? I mean, Martian Manhunter would be a great one to basically be sitting there doing this, given the telepathic powers.
Right. I have a lot of thoughts about how they did the whole program, and also how we do it in real life too. Because you mentioned confidentiality, and sometimes that is possible for us to do. Sometimes it's not. Especially like I work a lot with children, so I'm like, okay, so there's a limit when you work with kids. You also have to bring in the parents, because almost in a sense, it is more helpful to have the parents sort of be understanding and understand the child and how to interact with them in a more positive way, or in a way that is more helpful for the child, because we only see them for once a week, but the parents with them most of the time, so it's more helpful in that way. But one thing that I did like is when it was in my head, I was like, well, why is this a big deal? Like, why are we talking about this? But in the book, it was a big deal that Superman had to come out and talk about how, we are struggling, so we go and get help. And I'm like, wait, how is that a big thing? But again, I've been in this field for so long where I'm like, yeah, no, duh. Like, that's what you would do, or that will be like so much more beneficial. One of the reasons why I created, Psychology for Geeks, because I wanted more trained professionals to talk about mental health, because although there's a lot of artists that are creating amazing work and talk about self-care and all that, it is much more complicated than just have a rest day or don't forget to take deep breaths. Like, a lot of us need more. There's a lot more to therapy than just having those reminders. And sometimes, because we see it all the time on social media, we might forget about that, or we may be like, oh, well, we don't really need to go see a therapist because it's not so bad, or I'm just going to do self-care kind of thing. So I'm like, this is some.
And no, I apologize for interrupting, but especially that standpoint too is that notion that people expect the heroes not to need that.
Right. And there were so many heroes that they were like, in one way or another, they were talking about how, we're supposed to be perfect, so I can be talking about this, or like, I don't feel as comfortable talking about this or admitting this because I'm a hero and I'm supposed to be this. Like, no, I mean, okay, most of them were humans, some of them were not. But even then, like, they still needed help because they witness like the worst of humanity all the time. And like you said, like they're putting, their life in danger to help other people. And most of the time, those people that they save, either they just disappear and forget about them, or may turn them against them. Like, we see that happen often, like, with superheroes. So I'm like,
there's a third element too. Then you've also got the ones who are angry that the superhero didn't come to rescue them.
Right. Like, this is your job. You're supposed to come and help me. Yeah.
Right.
Or like, yeah.
Yeah, because
But
there's the
again,
ones
like,
that they came to. Yeah, there's the ones that they came to rescue who eventually, ideally, move on with life. But then you've got also that other person who, when the hero's dilemma choice comes up, do I rescue this person or this person? And the person that they didn't rescue then gets upset at them for not being there.
right. Or like, a lot of people where there's the complaint of like, well, you didn't rescue me well enough, or like, you could have gotten here sooner, or like, why didn't you prevent this from the beginning? And I'm like, okay, like, it's not easy.
Yeah, well, there's an entire freaking world. Guess what? There are multiple shits going down at the same time. And there's that aspect of triage.
But, we also see that in our sessions, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
We see people that come in and then they're like, help me, you have to do something to help me. Or they're like, okay, I'll give you 5 sessions. And in 5 sessions, you have to like completely cure me. I'm like, if I had that magic wand, it would be so much easier. But unfortunately, that's not how it works. Although they did add that. There was this one thing. I don't know if this is going to be too much of spoilers, but there was one situation in which it was the hero helping himself at the end.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, we don't want to, again, give the spoilers because we want people to read and recognize it. But the hero, and then this is in its own way, it's like empty chair.
Yes.
Yeah, so that aspect of you're talking to a piece of your or a part of yourself, which is also part of the principle of internal family systems, or IFS. That happened in this case because a hero had a chance to talk to actually himself, and actually it shows up twice in there, both with at the end, but also earlier on with Booster Gold as well when he's in the chamber.
Oh, that's true.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. Yeah, I forgot about that one. But then when I saw that happen, or like that plot point, I was like, that's exactly it. That's exactly what like therapists are supposed to be there for. We're supposed to only be there to provide a place for you to, an encouragement for you to get to a place where you can help yourself. Because again, we're only there to guide and support. We're not there to tell you what to do or to give you like the secret life recipe that somehow we've come up with from our research. If it was that easy, I would just post it everywhere, but it isn't.
Exactly.
But yeah,
exactly. And I think that's a great place for us to take our break. So this is Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered, with Elizabeth Arvizu, Arvizu, soon to be doctor. And stay tuned for our second half as we continue to have this conversation, folks. We'll be back shortly.
Follow Voice America at facebook.com/Voice America for juicy updates from your favorite radio shows and podcasts.
Our lives and the world around us can get messy and frustrating. Untangle and Grow Counseling's focus is to untangle that mess and make sense of it so you have a good foundation to build and grow from. Visit us on the web at untangleandgrowcounseling.com. Perry Clark offers individual psychotherapy, couples and family therapy, and adolescence therapy from a variety of coping materials and resources. Visit untangleandgrowcounseling.com for more information.
Enjoying our shows and can't get enough of us? Follow us on Instagram at Voice America Talk Radio and see what we're cooking up for you.
You are listening to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. If you have a question or comment about our podcast, send an email to pclark@untyingnotspodcast.com. That's pclark@untyingnotspodcast.com. And now, back to the program.
Hello, folks. Welcome back to the second half here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Elizabeth. Arvizu, soon to be doctor, and we were here talking about Heroes in Crisis from DC Comics. And I guess I made that Freudian slip because I'm thinking about when we were talking about Wakanda Forever and the great love triangle that's also associated in that one, or at least with the character of Namor and Sue Storm. So I think that's where I slipped up at.
And we were just talking about the previous episode as well. So.
Yeah, that's something we'll talk about on another podcast at some point. But what are some of the other things that I also found very interesting in looking at this is the variety of issues that characters that were there at Sanctuary dealing with, like Commander Steel, not a character I'm as familiar with, but he's dealing with the aspects of dying and coming back. Or there's another one named Solstice. Not as familiar with her abilities, but she's struggling with controlling the superhero version of herself and her human self. How does she get to live with that in that human self aspect? So we get a variety of characters here talking about the various struggles they're having with what it means to be heroes. And they're not all the same, too.
Yes, I appreciated that so much because that was exactly it. Because there was like, you see it quite at the beginning. Sometimes you see one, just the way that they did it, like the different panels. It was really amazing because, like you said, each one was struggling with something slightly different, but it's something still very relatable that we often experience in real life as well. The one that got me was Narc.
Oh, the Neanderthal one.
Yes, that's the one. And because he was struggling, he was like, okay, so, and he was so deep and philosophical. And I was like, wait, I don't think I can keep up with you. But he was talking about how living in the past had so many wonderful things that he missed, right? Like sort of life wasn't as complicated as it is nowadays, and his connection with nature was a lot deeper as well, and he had all his needs met, so he didn't really need more. And once he woke up in this world, there was so much going on that he was kind of like, oh, this is amazing, and things are like a lot easier than they were back in the day, but also a lot harder in some ways.
How much distant. And in many ways, he's also one of those characters who very much likely could have related with Wally about the loss. But there's never that chance because it's there. Even when they start talking about how Sanctuary is structured, the heroes there are all in complete anonymity because they're covered up in robes, wearing these face masks that make them all look the same, and they're not actually supposed to talk to each other.
Yes. So, okay, I was thinking that, and I just quickly trying to Google this because I want to make sure that I have the correct name. But as I mentioned earlier, like I am trying to learn more about my culture, and part of that is just learning more about me and how like culture is important. For me, growing up, or how it was missing, right? Like I mentioned earlier, like moving to the US was, it really took away all those ties that my parents still have with, the extended family. And I didn't really have that because we moved when we were very young, when I was very young. I can't find it. Anyway, so I am taking a class, and we were talking about this in it. And one of the things that came up was that somebody in the class asked why it was difficult for Hispanic or Latinx families to talk about mental health or to go to therapy, when in the past there's some evidence saying that even the Aztecs or the Mexica people, they valued mental health, and they had this book that spoke about it, like not in the same terms that we are using nowadays, but they were able to identify all these things. And I'm like, I didn't know that because I was so sort of removed from my roots. And so anyways, the question was like, okay, so why do you think if we were doing it before, what changed? And so there's a lot of different reasons for that. But one of the main ones that I was like, oh, yeah, I didn't think about this, is that therapy as we kind of know it, more because of the media and whatnot, was not really created for people of color. And so it's very uncomfortable for people to reach out and be in those spaces, because that's not what we know. We know like talking over coffee and bread, especially in the Mexican community. We're like, yes, cafecito and pan, that's what we do. And then, we're talking around in circles. We're, receiving that support from each other. And then I was like, oh, that is so true. Like, I've just been thinking about it since the other day that it was discussed. And I feel like it's something very similar to here, where like the heroes are kind of like struggling with reaching out for help, because it wasn't really like created. Like, a lot of them just needed someone to be like, yes, that sucks, and I've experienced something similar. You're not alone. Like maybe the struggle is a little bit different, the pain, because it's not exactly the same, but they needed that support from another person. But because everything was so secretive, and there was a lot of emphasis placed on that, like confidentiality,
the anonymity.
Yes, that support would have been so helpful as well. It was kind of pushed to the side.
Which is actually an amazing contrast, considering we're talking about the Justice League here, which is supposed to be a group of heroes supporting each other. But, that support only lies when we need to solve a problem and rescue humanity, not when we need to talk about our mental health.
Yeah. Like, one of the things that I kind of was like, I don't like this. Maybe this is why I didn't continue, like why Batman didn't continue being one of my favorites, was because, and this wasn't the first instance that we see it all the time, where he has backup plans for backup plans for backup plans, or how to stop people, because there are he's one of the few that doesn't have any superpowers. He's completely human. And then so he has all these plans on how to prevent, problems in case someone who has very strong powers goes berserk for some reason or another.
Which gets mentioned in here and exposed. And it's mentioned, the others know about it, and it actually gets used against him too.
Yes, like constantly, especially Superman. I feel like that's happening to him a lot with kryptonite. But then I'm like, okay, so they're supposed to be like good friends and colleagues, and like people who support each other. Yet Batman's still like, I don't really fully trust you though, and like the other person feels it too. They're like, okay, yeah, we all know that you don't really trust us. So there's this sort of like
there's a limit to how much. Yeah, there's a limit to how much actual trust and let alone vulnerability that can happen there. And I hate to say it, I just was dealing with kind of an issue of that earlier today, where despite the nature and our career aspects, as I was dealing with some other therapists, our ability to be vulnerable and also to practice that shared empathy went out the window.
Yes, because we all struggle too. Like, we all need our own therapist. We're not, and even though we're in the field, there are times where we all think, I can get through this. I don't really need help, or like, it'll be okay kind of thing. When we know that it will be better and everything will be resolved, we reach out to help. Or like, I think there's also too the aspect of, because you're dealing with it all the time, learning more and like trying to support people and help people, that you come to a place where you're like, I can't do this anymore. Like there has to be some sort of change or rest that is very important for us to have, as well as therapists. So then we can continue understanding, being understanding of others.
One of the big things that all of these heroes are having to deal with, because the simple fact, whether it's going from street level crime to the great cosmic crime, there's always seems to be a crisis.
Right? It never ends.
There is never ending crisis. I mean, as speak about issues of whether you consider it a good movie or not, the Daredevil movie that had Affleck in it. There was a scene in there where after a hard day of all the rescuing and so forth, he's at the end of the day, he's hurting, he's uncomfortable. The only way he can sleep is in a sensory deprivation tank. And as he's getting into the tank, he hears, because of his echolocation, someone crying out for help. Does he get out of the tank and go and help them? Or does he close the tank and sleep for himself? And he ends up choosing to close the tank and sleep.
Yeah, and that's also another thing that heroes have to deal with, right? Like they have to also take care of themselves, because it's impossible for them to be doing superhero things 24/7. Like they also need rest, they also need a life. And then and that's when we often hear people like, well, you're a superhero, why weren't you here? And I'm like, well, I still have a life. I need to take care of myself and sleep and eat and rest, like I can't be on it all the time.
And I think we also should extend the fact that I know we've talked about heroes, we've talked about the first responders, but this also happens in people's everyday life as well. Whether it is caregiving for either a sick child or a sick family member, whether it is going into in our case, a very hostile, toxic, maybe even heavily racist environment. Any of these various things. Even right now, one of the things where we struggle with for helping kids recognize they're dealing with a trauma. And you've got teachers exhausted because some of them were never even here to plan to be able to sit with little Billy and little Susie about what's happening at home because there's not enough food, or mom and dad are hitting each other, or dad and dad is caught up in a drug situation, or so on and so forth. They're here to try and teach them the ABCs in 1, 2, 3.
Right. Yes, there is that aspect as well of where there are so many professionals out there, especially teachers nowadays, where they are not only trying to teach you, but they're trying to, guide you as you're growing up and learning all these things about life, but also trying to keep you safe and also trying to figure out. So in my current job, we do a lot of assessments and evaluations, and so oftentimes it comes with the child was struggling with a learning difficulty, and it wasn't caught until years later, or even as adults, that's when it was caught. Once you're an adult and you're completely out of school, and then you get diagnosed with ADHD or autism, and then you're like, oh, everything makes sense now. And I never got the support that they needed because it wasn't seen. But I'm like, so whose fault is it? Is it the teacher for never noticing when the teacher has 1,000,001 other things that they're trying to do at the same time? Was it the parents' fault for not noticing when the parents don't really know, right? They don't really understand. They were trying the very best that they could. Most of the time, that's how it happens, or they didn't realize. And they're like, oh, my child just needs a little extra help or whatever. Or
even the aspect of culture saying that this is either normalized or somehow they were automatically bad to begin with.
Right. Or as a parent, oh, this is my fault for not raising them right.
Or that I've somehow sinned against God, and this is the punishment I'm getting. Because I've heard that too from parents.
Yeah. And so it's a lot more complicated than just that. Life is not... I think that's one of the things I appreciate about sort of the DC universe is that not only is there always something that is happening, but also they showed you how complex things are, for humans and for aliens and superheroes. Everyone is really constantly struggling with something, and it's not everything is black and white.
And it never has been. But it's problematic when you have people who only want to hold to black and white, which is we also see in here with the aspect of it's either Booster Gold or Harley Quinn who are responsible for this tragedy.
Right.
And what become and the battleground that you also see with the other hero is going is we're having to take sides, and we're hunting down Booster Gold and Harley Quinn to figure out which one of them actually did it. I mean, at some point, it's kind of surprising no one even brought the idea that they did it together.
Yeah, that was a really nice twist.
Mm-hmm.
There, where they're like,
yeah,
yes,
again,
I don't want to spoil it too much.
We're not giving spoilers. But I'm sure the more astute will probably be able to figure out who we're talking about, especially if once they start reading this.
Yeah. The only one since I work with kids all the time, the only sort of the youngest one that was portrayed here was probably Robin. He was one of the youngest that was here. And now I'm thinking about it, because now that I finally read this comics, I realized that I have a book that was for children as well. It's called Even Superheroes Have Bad Days. And it's basically just talking about how even heroes can feel sad and they are afraid and all these things. Even though they do all these great things or they have all this great power, they still struggle with the same things that we struggle as well. And I'm like, yes, like we need to start talking about those things. And sometimes as parents, we're like, oh, we want to protect the children and not talk about difficult things happening. But difficult things are happening and the child is noticing, especially now with everything that's happening at the schools.
Well, whether it's the schools or even in the household. I mean, even if they aren't openly fighting, but they can see a tension between the parents. And who knows what it is, whether it's from money to emotional abuse to sexual assault, or even the problems with just the relationship that was happening with the parents from the very beginning. They can pick it up. And we do see that too when we get we get Robin, we get Nightwing, we get Red Hood all talking about the aspect of comparing themselves against each other, because each one of them wore the mantle of Robin, have worked with Batman, and now I also wonder is like how much is this issue that they're having because of working with Batman, and he did some sort of comparison to the previous Robins.
Or even if he didn't, like they're still doing it because they're like aware. And I forgot who it was. It might have been Nightwing who was talking about like, well, so this Robin brought this to the table and this other one brought this other thing. So what am I bringing to the table? Am I like disposable or something? And I'm like, I think we should do just another one where we just talk about Batman because there's so much we can just talk about.
Right. And there's an example of one of the other issues is some of the other issues comes up is the comparison trap that people can both get into and people can avoid doing altogether. So there, makes me wonder about who they consulted with mental health wise when they were figuring out what to bring up for the various characters. I mean, because even there's one where a brief panel where they have Dr. Light, or a version of Dr. Light, talking about the fact that she's there being a hero when another Dr. Light was a villain. And having to bear the name and everything that they did.
That is a very good question that you asked, like, who did they consult? Or if they consulted anyone. Because lately I've been reading a couple of different comics and books where the writer is not necessarily a mental health professional. And there's some things where I'm like, yeah, like this could have been, addressed in a slightly different manner or like talked about slightly different. But I am very glad that we are just openly talking about mental health. But yes, consulting with a professional is better.
Definitely, which I always still bring back to the aspect too of how we are also as a profession portrayed in a lot of media, especially some of the comic books, because if you look at any of the Marvel stuff that has come out, there has been at least at some point a therapist or somebody who's therapically minded present, and yet we're kind of somehow turned into either a joke or turned into a hostile factor. It's like, yeah, none of those things are what we would do. Which also brings up the aspect, when was the last time we saw any of these heroes being mental health workers or in their day job?
Wow, that's a good question. It's usually just like
universes.
Yeah, it's just usually like a brief scene where they're getting coffee with a friend right before they have to rush off and save someone.
But we seem to get a superhero whose essentially day job is a mental health worker?
Well, hold on. Like that's one of the things that I don't know enough about Harley Quinn for this, but throughout this comic, she was kind of hinting at, doesn't work.
Right. Well, but especially in that standpoint too, Harley Quinn, while she started out as a PhD doctor working at Arkham, she did, I hate to say it, she was also tricked by Joker, became put into the fluid that created the Joker, and she was for a long time a villain. Yeah, she's been doing a lot more things that are heroic, or shall we say anti-hero-ish. But again, when do we actually have a hero whose work or focus when they're not out risking their lives is a mental health professional?
We don't. There are some superheroes that are more spiritual in some ways or another. Yeah, but it's not brought up as often as it could.
Yeah. I mean, I know I think in DC, not in DC, Marvel, there was Doc Samson, who was sometimes brought in as a mental health consultant for the Hulk. I know in Young Justice, there was a point where they had Black Canary acting kind of as the therapist to the Young Justice characters in the first season. But really, where is there any of these superheroes whose primary job or central training is actually in psychology?
It's not very glamorous for a superhero to be that.
Which then brings us back to the aspect of how are we normalizing mental health? And the fact that a mental health worker can also be a hero.
But also kind of like slightly going back to Harley Quinn, where like the whole time he was like, yeah, sorry to tell you, but therapy doesn't work or whatever. And there are people who have not had a great experience when they first reach out. And then so they're like, well, it doesn't work. Where am I going to go? But this is why I always talk to all of my clients whenever I meet someone, like even just in my own personal life. And I'm like, you have to also interview your therapist because it has to be a good fit for you. You have to feel comfortable with them. If you don't, then it's not going to be a good process. It's not going to be a good safe space for you to process what you need to process, or, you know, to be who you really are without having to hide for some reason or another.
Exactly.
So that's really important. Yeah.
Which comes back to what we were also saying at the beginning about the aspect that the concepts of what is mental health today was not built around the concepts of what's necessary for POC. And I'd also go as far as to say we're also dealing with the influences of insurances and money about how we get to practice and how we are able to serve and provide for those that come to see us as mental health workers.
Yeah, that is very true, because we are limited. The people that come to see us are also limited, depending on what their copay is and whether or not they can afford it, you know, that month or that week. It's yeah. I have this shiny outlook of life in where I want to create or work with other people to create a world where we can talk more openly about mental health and openly admit, hey, I need a mental health day, I can't come to work today, and that's something that's okay. And or for you to walk up to your friend and be like, hey, can I just have a hug, or can you come and sit, listen to me rant for a few minutes? I really need that right now. I have this hope that if we normalize it more, we'll start to understand each other more. And not only ourselves, but, you know, each other. We'll have like that compassion and empathy would be more present or be stronger, because we sort of understand. We're openly talking about and being honest with each other and ourselves about what we need and what we're going through. Very
true. Which, and this is about where we're going to wrap up on. One last thing that sort of comes up is, especially on that note, which is one of the things that I think too is a struggle we hit with mental health, and especially situations like this, is also the aspect of consequences. And it is important for us to be able to recognize and share all of the things that we have talked about, but we also have to deal with consequences. And just because somebody has gone through a mental health crisis, some of the things that come with it, we can't also ignore, which is one of those elements which, when you get to the end of the story, you'll notice that some definite consequences are being held and recognized, but they're also, in their own way, contributing to the further problem too.
I think because kind of going back to what we're talking about, wait, my mind is blanking now, but like,
just look at the end of the book.
This black and the black and white thinking sometimes that we prefer because it's a lot simpler, than seeing all the different shades of gray in life. And so sometimes it's a lot easier to address the symptom than it is to address the root of the problem. And that's a big thing that kind of got missed, and it gets missed often in real life, in movies, comics, whatever.
And that can also be a very big factor into who and how you're working with your therapist. There are some who, because of all the natures of either the setting or, again, like I mentioned, the insurance, there might be some who focus on giving you short-term, more of a Band-Aid approach. There are others who will be better at working at long-term, really digging in to try and get to that source root. And that takes time. That's not going to be done in 5 weeks. So that's also one of those aspects of picking the right therapist, and both for you and for the therapist to pick to be able to work with. Because I know there was one point in the book where they were all comparing in the chamber how long they'd been at Sanctuary.
Yeah, that also makes me think too, is like the other way around too, because we have this phrase that we use sometimes. We're like, oh, they were not there yet. The client wasn't there yet, so they're not coming back for therapy. And I'm like, wait, is it that they weren't ready for change, or is it that we weren't providing the help in the way that they needed it at that time? So like there's things for us to consider as well, like on our end, because even though like Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, they created this thing to, help each other. They were things that were missed.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's like there are probably so many more things we could have also talked about in this podcast that we just don't have the time for.
For sure.
Exactly. So with that, we need to be wrapping up. I want to thank you again for coming and sitting with me to talk about this and our field and geeking out.
Well, thank you for creating a space where this is possible.
Happy to. So where can folks find you, and where can they hear more about your work?
All right. So like I said earlier, I changed my social media handle. It's the same for all my social media. So you can find me on TikTok and Facebook and Instagram. Those are the ones that I use the most often. And I am there at psych, the number 4, geeks. And my website, I have some resources and things for people there as well, so they can check out. And that is at psychologyforgeeks.com.
Okay. So I'll have that in the show notes. So please, folks, read Heroes in Crisis. Seek out a therapist. I know we're a little in demand at the moment right now, but just keep at it. There is hope out there. And sometimes you need to put on your own hero's cape, and that is you seeking out mental health. So we look forward to seeing you in the Hall of Justice as well. Be well.
Thank you for tuning in for Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. Be sure to join your host, Perry Clark, for another episode on the podcast coming soon on the Voice America Empowerment Channel.